Hello, and welcome to the third class, Beekeeping, Beginning Beekeeping, Equipment and Bees. Third class in the course, Beginning Beekeeping. So today we're going to be looking at selecting woodenware, tools, and your protective gear. Question you might want to ask yourself is, what kind of hive? What are the parts of a hive? What kind of protective gear is available? What sort of tools do I want to work the bees? And then what kind of bees should I get, and where do I get them? So last time, going over biology, we came to understand the life cycle of the bee and of the superorganism of the colony. We are now familiar with who's in the box and what they will be doing at any given time within their life cycle and within the year. So today we're going to be talking about beekeeping gear, woodenware, tools, and protective gear. Other tools that are available for things like harvesting honey and wax and pollen. Tools for doing outreach and education in the community. And then in the in-person course, we handed out magazines for several beekeeping equipment purveyors. On the classroom resource page, we'll be offering some links to those same purveyors and encourage you to have a look around and see what's available. So woodenware, one thing to say about it is that it in North America must have movable frames, and it should respect bee space. You don't want to violate bee space. Bee space is 3/8 to 1/4 inch. More than that, and they'll fill it in with wax, or less than that, and they'll fill it up with propolis. So we're going to be looking at the most common types of woodenware. These are the Langstroth hive, the top bar hive, and it is very much what it sounds like. You have bars of wood that go across on the top, and the bees build their comb on that. And the Ware, which is similar to a top bar hive. It's kind of like a cross between a Langstroth hive, a top bar hive, and a tree cavity. Something else to mention about woodenware is that it's not necessarily made of wood. There's several products that are out there that are made of plastic or styrofoam. Ancient Egyptian beehives were made of clay. So some of the questions you'll ask yourself are, am I going to build this myself? Am I going to buy a kit that I will assemble? Am I going to buy something that is pre-assembled? Or do I want to purchase something that is pre-assembled and already painted? So when you're thinking about what you will use to contain your colony, you really want to think about a bee's natural habitat. And in a natural habitat, such as in this downed log, you will have a space that's roughly about the size of a 5-gallon bucket. Originally, this was part of a tree, and it was about 10 to 15 feet off the ground and had a small defensible entrance. Those are things that bees will often look for. This is a cutout that we performed, actually removing this colony from inside of a structure. We went through the outside wall. This is up by Van Ness on Connecticut Avenue. And this is a second-story building, so 12 to 15 feet in the air, 3 meters up in the air. It, before we opened it up, had a small defensible entrance, and the cavity size was just right. So again, your natural habitat, small defensible entrance, 3 to 5 meters up, entrance facing south, small defensible entrances. They prefer the cavity size that's a little smaller than the managed colony size. A cavity is encased in several inches of wood, which has an R value, which has an insulative value. So that helps the bees to keep themselves warm in winter and cool in summer. And then, of course, your average tree cavity is not something that you can open up to have a look at and inspect to make sure that there's not any extremely communicable diseases that are going to kill that colony and all the colonies in the surrounding area. And then you can't really do anything. You might potentially be able to stick an orthoscope in the hole and have a bit of a peek inside to see what's going on, and you can do some entrance observations to have a sense of how large the colony is and what kinds of things they're bringing in. But there's not much more than that you can do to find out what's happening. And then if you're interested in honey, to harvest honey from a situation like this, it's basically total destruction of the nest. Now, if you take this section here in the middle and you cut it out and you set it on something that's more accessible, you would call it a gum. And so a gum is essentially a hollowed out log where people, prior to Langstroth and the movable frames, and prior to the law in North America that requires movable frames, people would use gums and skeps. And a skep is essentially like a woven grass basket that's turned upside down, and it creates a warm, dry habitat for the bees. Obviously, they're totally illegal now. This is a skep from the bottom, and you can see how the bees have drawn their comb in there. A little bit higgledy-piggledy, but one thing I can say is notice the bee space, and they attempt, even though they're drawing comb in all these different directions, they do attempt to be fairly consistent about their bee space. Again, more instances of bee space. This first picture is a colony that had swarmed, and the swarm had a hard time deciding where they were going to move to. The scouts were not successful at finding a place or recruiting the rest of the swarm to go there, and those bees ended up expending a lot of resources building these combs out in the open, apparently not realizing that this was not going to be a colony solution that was going to work as the winter started to come on. We did eventually remove these combs and actually rehome these bees into a standard Langstroth colony. Here is another instance of a skep that's upside down, and you can see that they do try very hard to maintain that bee space. And the third picture is of a box from a Langstroth hive where the bottom box had bees in it and the top box had some sugar feed in it, and then it was forgotten and left unattended as the bees moved into spring. They decided that they wanted more room, and so they built all of these combs at this crazy diagonal. But it's very clear that they are evenly spaced and that they honor bee space. So bee space is a natural phenomenon, and bees will close gaps narrower than 3/8 or 1/4 inch. And they will use gaps of 3/8 to 1/4 inch as the areas that they move through, and they will fill in wider areas with comb. They'll just build wax. So as we mentioned previously, Langstroth was this guy who in the 1800s developed this concept of movable frames, and to the left is a picture of a colony that we took where the bees had drawn wax in all manner of shapes, however they saw fit, but if you put the movable frames in there, they will draw the wax on the frames. And even these frames on the right are a little bit wonky if you look at how they're fit together. These are honey frame, at least these are honey deposits at the top, and often they draw the honeycomb out further, and sometimes you have to be sure to put the frames back in the order that you took them out in, because they won't fit back together neatly in any other order. So the Langstroth hive, the first practical movable hive, it didn't actually look like this. It was a little bit more complicated than this. It's been sort of simplified down to some key components, and it's essentially a sense of organized chaos and incorporates bee space. As time has gone on, we have become more and more standardized with our sizes of boxes and frames. It used to be if you purchased your boxes from one purveyor and your frames from another purveyor, the frames may not fit in the box, but that has over time become less and less of an issue. So the movable frame box was invented in 1851 in the US, it's patented in 1852, and all the components are separate. So the terms that we use for the Langstroth colony are shallow, medium, and deep. Not very many people these days use shallow. Shallow was more for honey production, and it's still pretty good if you want to do cut comb honey, and that requires wax foundation or natural combs without any wire in them. They are unwired wax foundation or natural combs. Your mediums, you can use a wired foundation, which is wax that has been rolled and pressed out to sort of begin the cells on the comb. You can get natural unwired foundation, but in that larger span, sometimes it can become a liability. And then you can get a plastic foundation, which is very stable and really good if your intention is to use a centrifuge. And then you have your deeps, and your deeps are obviously the deep ones, the ones that are a little bit taller. So all boxes have bee space, and they are all the same length, but they vary between height and width. So defined by size, 8 and 10 frame equipment have different widths. One set of equipment can fit 10 frames, and one set of equipment can fit 8 frames. Deep boxes are 9 5/8 inches tall. Mediums, sometimes referred to as Illinois boxes, although that is less and less frequently that people refer to them as Illinois boxes. Mediums are 6 5/8 inches tall, and your shallow boxes are 5 11/16. So, and then they're defined by use. So you have brood boxes where the bees raise their young, and then you have honey supers where the bees store their honey. So one is more sort of like the nursery, and the other is more like the pantry or the larder. So inside of those deep, medium, and shallow boxes, you have frames, and the frames are slightly smaller, and that is to accommodate bee space with the bees moving laterally inside of the hive between the boxes. So the frame for the deep is 9 1/8 inches, medium is 6 1/4 inches, and your shallow is 5 3/8 inches. And the frame materials can be different. There can be wood and plastic frames. Sometimes inside of the wood you have wired beeswax, sometimes you have plain beeswax, and sometimes you have beeswax coated plastic foundation. And then with the plastic frames, the whole frame, the outside part is completely plastic, and as well as the internal compartment, the actual comb. So with the plastic frames, it can either be a foundation layer, which is like a thin layer that then the bees draw wax on top of that to create the combs, or it can actually be that the cells themselves are made out of plastic. So the integrated plastic foundation or the cells. So here we have some pictures of the different kinds of foundation. The top one is an unwired beeswax foundation. The middle one is a black plastic beeswax coated foundation. The main reason for using the plastic foundation is that it's much sturdier, and even in high heat it won't deform. And also, if you want to use a centrifuge to extract the honey and give the bees back their wax, the plastic foundation makes the whole comb much more stable. But if you want to compromise, you can get the foundation that is at the bottom, which is a deep foundation in this picture. You can get it in the other sizes too, medium and shallow. And it is comprised of wax with fine wires running through it, wired wax foundation. And that just adds an additional level of stability. You can still blow it out in a centrifuge pretty easily though. So the 8 versus 10 frame hive, same height. The 8 frame is just a narrower width, and that is because you are only putting 8 frames in there instead of 10. But that difference in width makes a big difference in weight. So the width is 14 inches versus 16 1/4 inches for the 10 frame. And the weight when full for a medium 8 frame is 40, and the medium 10 frame is going to be 50. When you talk about the deep, the difference between the 8 frame weighing 60 pounds versus the 10 frame weighing 80 pounds, now we're talking about a significant difference in weight. So hive components. You have your hive stand. This particular kind of hive stand is not necessarily something that everyone uses, but everyone does use some kind of hive stand. And the hive stand, the point of the hive stand is to elevate the hives off of the surface, the ground or the rooftop, to a point that the bees are not landing on the ground and entering from the ground, where if it rains, the hive is not getting flooded. And our personal preference is to build a hive stand that is between 18 to 24 inches tall and put the hive bodies on top of that. For us as fairly tall people, it's much more ergonomical for us to work a hive that is 18 to 24 inches off the ground than one that is located nearer to the ground than that. And the next piece that you will put down is the bottom board. And that is what it sounds like. It is the board that goes on the bottom. And there are different kinds of bottom boards. You have solid bottom boards, which are wooden all the way across, and then you have screen bottom boards. And the screen bottom boards perform two functions. One function is that they can offer additional ventilation in hot weather, and they also can be used as part of an integrative pest management scheme wherein you're able to discern the number of mites in your colony by counting the number of mites that drop onto the bottom board and stick to something that you smear on there over a period of time, usually 24 to 48 hours. Also with the bottom board is this is where you will have located your entrance reducer, which is very useful to prevent robbing behavior during the dearth when there's not a lot of forage available. Bees will sometimes rob out other colonies if they're easy to get into. And then in the fall and winter months, you put a mouse guard on there to prevent mice from moving into your colony that the bees are keeping so warm for them and have filled up very handily with food. It's very unpleasant to have mice contaminate your honey boxes, your bee boxes. So on top of the bottom board, you have your brood boxes, and then you may have brood boxes of different sizes. Deep brood boxes are obviously going to be heavier than medium brood boxes. If you're using 10 frame equipment, it's going to be 2 deep boxes or 3 medium boxes. If you're using 8 frame equipment, you may need up to as many as 4 medium 8 frame boxes for your brood chamber alone. And then 8 or 10 frames with foundation. And then if you are planning to produce honey, there are several ways to keep the queen from laying eggs in your honey boxes, but one of the most common ways is to use a queen excluder, and then you would put your honey supers above that. On top of your honey supers, you would put an inner cover, and this essentially keeps the outer cover. It's sort of a protective thing that keeps the outer cover from being stuck down with propolis to the top of the honey super. It's also very handy if you want to then stick another box on top of the inner cover that's empty and then put feeders above the inner cover, and then put the telescoping cover over the top of that, so that inner cover can produce a sort of upper chamber, an attic, if you will, where you can feed the bees in the attic, and it's much more defensible than if you feed the bees at the entrance. And then an outer cover, and the outer cover, the lip of the outer cover goes down over the sides of the top of whatever the box is that you have up on top, and that prevents water from blowing in. It's kind of like a roof with eaves, I suppose. So your hive setup options are, you have the bottom, the hive stand, the bottom board, a couple of 10 frame deep boxes, and then a honey super and an inner cover and a telescoping cover. Or you have a hive stand, a bottom board, and if you have 10 frame equipment, you might only have 3 brood chamber boxes. If you have 8 frame equipment, you may eventually need 4 brood chamber boxes, telescoping cover on top of the inner cover. Honey boxes are essentially boxes for stored food. Your basic honey supers, medium or shallow boxes, 8 or 10 frames of foundation in each box, or there are more advanced options specialty honey making. So you may use cut comb, which is essentially either the natural wax foundation unwired or allowing the bees to draw out their own natural combs. If you do allow the bees to draw out their own natural combs, it's good to have already drawn comb on either side that's drawn straight. So when they draw out their own natural combs, they will draw that straight and in alignment with the rest of the comb that's in the box. But if you get shallow boxes for cut comb honey, you essentially just cut out the comb from the interior of the wooden frame and slice it up and set it somewhere to drain off the cells that you cut through so that it's not continuing to drain and be sticky. There's Ross rounds, which are an option, and these are plastic rings that go into a special holder. It does have a natural wax foundation that goes underneath, and so when the bees draw out the wax on that foundation, they do so within these rounds, and then you just pop out the whole round, the whole plastic ring, and then there's a shell that comes with it. There's a bottom and a top, and you put the bottom underneath the on the bottom, and then you set the ring, fits perfectly inside of that bottom shell, and then you put the top shell over the top of it, and then you wrap a piece of tape around the seam between the top and the bottom, and you have this very handy cassette of honey that's very easy to transport. And some people really like the honeycomb because they know that it's actually from a bee and that it's not adulterated with anything else. And so if you sell honey, some of your customers may really like the Ross rounds. Another option to Ross rounds are the basswood squares. Again, these are very similar to the Ross rounds, except for their these specialty wooden, very slender wood frames that fit 4 of them across inside of almost a standard size wooden frame. And so the bees draw out their comb inside of these boxes that have a wax foundation in them. And these are also very easy to package. So without having to extract honey either with a centrifuge or via crush and strain method, those are very easy ways to purvey honey. So there's several different kinds of feeders. There's a few different times of year when you may need to feed bees to bolster them or to support them during dearth, or if they just don't have enough food for some reason in the colony and there's none in the environment. It then comes down to the beekeeper to make sure that the bees have enough to eat. So one of the kinds of feeders is called an entrance feeder. And in our mid-Atlantic region, I highly recommend that you do not use these Boardman feeders or entrance feeders for sugar syrup, that you reserve these specifically for water. If you want to put water on the front of your hive, that's fine. If you want to have water near your hive in a bird bath or a stream or some sort of self-renewing resource, that's fine too. Those are a matter of preference. These Boardman feeders don't last long in the summer heat. You will need to replenish them. And do not put sugar feed in there because you will be inviting robbers and you will end up potentially with a dead colony. So, division board feeder or frame feeder is another type of feeder. This one is a 2-frame feeder, so it takes up the space of 2 frames in the box. And this one is also a deep, so it is deeper than would fit into a medium or shallow. You can buy single frame feeders that are mediums. Those are very useful if you want to quickly feed a nucleus colony or an 8-frame colony, just to help it get going. Then you have pail or jar feeders, and these are essentially just canning jars with canning jar lids with some small holes poked in them. If you use these, you want to make sure that you puncture the holes from the inside out, because when the bees stick their proboscis up inside the hole to feed, if you have punctured them from the outside in, there will be all of those sharp edges, and they will cut up their proboscis. Also, you don't want to sand the puncture smooth, because then the whole entire interior of that puncture spot will be very sharp. So you don't want to damage your bees. Another form of feeder are these baggy feeders. We never used these until it became very easy to get biodegradable plastic or biodegradable sandwich bags, and now we sometimes use them because you can't really reuse them. The way that you use these baggy feeders is you have a shim goes on top of the the box, the uppermost box, and then you put these baggy feeders on top of the frames, and wherever the natural bubble is inside of the plastic bag, you just slice it with a very sharp razor, just a small slice, and because that's where the bubble is, the feed doesn't pour out, because naturally it's going to settle away from that spot. So the bees can crawl up and they can feed, and those baggies will become emptied, and then when they're emptied, you chuck them. Because if you try to reuse them, when you put them back on top, that bubble spot might be in a different location. So then you'll have sugar water pouring out of these baggies on top of your frames, which is not what you want. And then there's the hive top feeder, and there's several forms of the hive top feeder. Here's an older form of the hive top feeder. This one required a shim to go around the outside. So it sits on top of the box beneath it, and between this white and this brown space, the bees can run up inside of this white cover and access the sugar water that's inside of this reservoir, and they can do so safely without floating out into the reservoir and drowning. They have several types of top feeders. Some of them have wooden rafts that float that are supposed to support the bees so they can crawl out on these rafts and feed and go back down. I have found that these wooden raft top bar feeders end up drowning a lot of bees. They have other more modern top feeders than the one that I'm showing here, where they have two troughs and a dividing ridge that has a mesh over it, so the bees can run up in the middle and run down the side of the mesh over the lip of the ridge, so they can get to the sugar water and return safely. But please note, and I think I already mentioned this briefly, that due to slight design differences in boxes and frames, different beekeeping supply companies, the frames and boxes may not necessarily be 100% compatible, although that is something that seems to be getting better. So some other types of frames with hives with movable frames. We have the top bar hive, which is in the middle, or often referred to as the Kenyan top bar hive. We have the Ware style hive, which is the one on the right, and on the left, this is an Australian flow hive. We have all of these kinds of hives in our apiaries. We run them every year just to make sure that we're learning all, best management practices so we can help other people out with overcoming their challenges. So the flow hive seems like it might be very easy, and that's one of the things that seems to attract people to it, but it does require management. You still have to take care of the bees and manage the bees, and you may even have to manage them more than you manage other hive types. It's sort of like a Langstroth style hive with a special kind of honey super. But this is definitely non-standard equipment, so it's not an 8 and it's not a 10, it is a 9. And they do not sell 9s in North America. You have to order or make a 9. You have to order to make one, or you have to order it from the Flow Hive company, or there are other people in Australia who make 9-frame equipment to be compatible with the Flow Hive. Um, and it's a different harvesting technique, and it's a little bit advanced. If you have a Flow Hive, the honey harvesting is definitely going to be a second-year goal, and then you definitely really want to very carefully follow the inventor manual. And then also, if you're thinking about getting a Flow Hive, just be aware that within the beekeeping community, there's a certain amount of hostility towards Flow Hive beekeepers, just because the perception is that if you are getting a Flow Hive or you have a Flow Hive, you don't really care about the bees, you just want to be lazy and eat honey, and you don't really want to do real beekeeping, you want to do bee having and honey eating. And so sometimes there can be a little bit of hostility towards Flow Hive beekeepers. Just be aware. So then Kenyan top bar hive is another one. This one is a little bit fancier than the first one that we saw. This one is up on a stand and it has a hinged lid. And it has these top bars, so these bars that go across, and the bees draw a natural wax. And due to the U shape of the colony, if you look at the end of the box, it sort of looks like a V with the bottom point cut off. That very well mimics the natural combs, and the bees will draw these lovely natural U-shaped combs, and they don't usually bother to attach them because the natural comb shape is this lovely U shape. However, it's a different story when you get to the warre, and I'll show you what that is later. But it somewhat simulates a colony in a downed tree, and you do work it from back to front. It's not top to bottom like in a stackable hive. This is all on sort of like a rambler. It's all on one level. And it does have the movable frames, and they come in lots of different shapes and sizes. They are not standardized. Quite often they're just made with some plank wood by somebody who wants to have a beehive, and you know, the barrier to entry for a standard Langstroth hive can be a little expensive. So then there's the Ware hive, which is very similar to a top bar hive. It's a cross between a top bar hive, a tree cavity, and Langstroth hive. You do have this stacking feature, so top to bottom, up and down management. You do have the top bar style, so these are not frames, these are just top bars, and the bees draw natural wax on them. Now, because they are square, the bees will often try to completely fill the space. And when they do this, what they end up doing is attaching the wax, um, uh, the comb, to the sides of the ware hive. And because they do not have a complete frame around them, when you go to remove a frame or remove a top bar, and the wax is drawn and attached to the sides of the box, it becomes really difficult to get these wax panels out without tearing them apart. So the ware was supposed to more carefully mimic the interior of a tree. It was invented by Abe Emilio Ware in the 20th century, and he was hoping that because it can also be a non-standardized thing. It's just bars, that it may lower the barrier to entry and make it more accessible for more people to keep bees. So you have these vertical wooden wedge top bars, and then when you add boxes to this equipment, you add them to the bottom as opposed to the top, which is your standard link drop procedure. Also, you end up doing very few inspections, in part because every time you inspect, you're faced with trying to get those bars out without ripping the whole frame apart. And there are a lot of design variants. And to harvest the honey from this kind of hive, you use the crush and strain harvest method. So when it comes to actually constructing your own equipment, you want to make sure that you take the time and invest in building some sturdy, solid stuff. You want to make sure that you are not violating bee space, because the bees will rectify it one way or another. Either they'll glue it all up, or they'll put a whole bunch of extra comb in there, and it's just going to get messy. So you want to make sure that everything is square. So if you're building your own boxes and your own frames, you actually do want to use a square to be sure that everything is square, so that everything fits together and stacks up properly. You want to use a glue as well as staples or screws, as well as nails or screws, and you want to use a water-based, water-resistant, food-safe product. Your standard wood glue was probably sufficient to the task. And then you want to use screws if you could use screws. If you can't use screws, use nails, and if you can't use nails, then you can use staples. But your screws are going to hold things more tightly, and you're going to be able to tighten them up if they ever do get loose. And the least sturdy way to build is with staples. And then you have to remember that frames take punishment, and they take a lot of torque, and you have to pull on them, and you have to push on them, and if you're going to use frames in a centrifuge, they're going to have all that sideways torsion on them. So you have to think about those kinds of things when you are putting your frames together. Make sure they're good and solid. And then if you have gear that you want to paint, you want to make sure it's 2 or 3 coats of exterior surface paint with low volatile organic compounds. So not a lot of off-gassing. You want something like a latex with a low VOC, or something that's going to be water-based. And then you want to make sure that it has a chance to cure and stops off-gassing completely before you move bees in, because bees are very sensitive to pollutants in the air. So as I mentioned before, not all woodenware is made of wood. You can get some that are made of styrofoam. You can get some that are made of plastic, pre-assembled, painted equipment. And then many pros just buy assembled gear because they don't have time to assemble it all. And then you have these different alternative materials. One thing I will say is be careful if you're thinking about purchasing used equipment, especially frames. Just be sure of the source and be sure of why the equipment is vacant. And if there's any question in your mind, don't use somebody else's old equipment, because you don't know why their bees died. Maybe they died of a disease that's going to be communicable to your diseases to your bees through the equipment. So something else that you're going to need, it's sort of part of your tool kit, is a smoker. Several different kinds of smokers, but I really recommend that you get a good size smoker with a heat shield around it. That's that cage looking thing around it to protect you and your objects in your bee bucket or your bee bag from getting too toasty up against the sidewall of that fire chamber. So the rule of thumb is that the larger the smoker, the easier to light and to keep it lit. Personal protective equipment. Notice that this guy is completely covered, but his feet are bare. That's some hive tool he has, right? So protection. You decide how much coverage you need. It's important for you to feel comfortable, especially if you haven't been in beehives before. Most important thing is for you to feel like you're buttoned up sufficiently so that you don't have to worry and have anxiety, because the bees will pick up on it and they will light you up. So I strongly recommend that you cover your face and eyes. Um, uh, any kind of a smack on the bridge of your nose is going to create a reaction, and a bee sting suddenly smacking you on the bridge of your nose is definitely going to create a reaction, and depending on the reaction you have, you could make it much worse. So it's best just to cover up, and definitely for many times until you have a level of comfort, and then keep on wearing your veil. Most people wear veils for most things most of the time. So you want to cover your exposed skin. You can use thick long sleeve shirts and blue jeans. I don't recommend that you wear black, because black triggers a mechanism in the bees where they will attack because they think it's a bear. So dark brown and black are sort of out. But anything else, it's good to wear long sleeves, long pants, closed-toe shoes, and then somehow close up your pant legs. You want to either tuck them into your socks or have them elasticize around your ankle, or some people use the bicycle um, elastics that you use when you ride a bike to keep your pant leg out of your chain. Um, You want to use sting-resistant material, something a little thicker, elastic cuffs to protect against bees crawling up inside of your shirt, and then your additional equipment. So some people have a full suit, some people wear gloves, veil, hat. A sweatband is always a nice thing to have, and you want to have a shirt or jacket that you're wearing underneath there. And then your typical choices for veils are the full suit with the round veil, a jacket. Notice this lady's wearing black jeans, and she's probably going to get some stings along her legs there. You can get just the hat with the veil, and then all of the veils come in either this round veil type or the fencing veil type. Now, the fencing veil ribs are sort of accordioned together with mesh, and that face piece on it can press against your face pretty easily. So if you're thinking you want to try the fencing veil style, I recommend that you also wear a baseball cap or something with a bill to keep that face piece from pressing up against your face, because that will leave you open to getting stung in the face through your veil. And then gloves. So you have the option of leather full-length glove, leather garden glove, dishwashing glove, latex or non-latex, like hospital-style gloves. That's down to your comfort level. Now, some people will take off their gloves altogether. Some people will just wear very thin gloves just to protect their hands from getting sticky and propolisy and stained. And some people really need a thicker glove. So those are all options for you to try. We tend to, depending on what we're doing, we either use dishwash gloves, because you can reuse those several times, or if it's something that's light but where it's kind of dirty at the same time, we may use the hospital style non-latex or latex gloves. Dexterity can be an issue when you're wearing these heavy leather gloves. So some people take the dishwashing gloves and they'll cut off the thumb and forefinger. just to give that additional dexterity. Of course, that does mean that the thumb and forefinger are available to get stung, so it's entirely up to you. Some people don't wear gloves at all. If you do decide that you want to purchase beekeeping gloves specifically, the place that you measure your hand to decide what size of glove you wear is around the base of your palm on the outside of your thumb, as per the picture, the image. So there's a variety of different tools to use to do various different tasks in beekeeping. The bottom one is a wax pick. It's like a comb for removing the outer layer of wax when you're going to extract the honey from it. So it's a capping comb. And then the upper thing is a long-nosed lighter. So that is very handy for getting down into the bottom of your smoker and lighting it. It's basically just a barbecue lighter. You have a variety of different hive tools. They all perform the same essential purpose, which is to leverage the frames apart and to help you lift the frame. And to pull nails. That's what that little key-shaped hole is in there, is to pull out nails. And they're also pretty handy for smacking nails back in again. Also, you can use the sharp edge of the tool to scrape the tops of your frames and around the edges of your boxes, just to keep your equipment clean as you go along. So definitely recommend a smoker, a hive tool, and a bee brush. If you use a bee brush, you want to get one that has synthetic bristles. It may be counterintuitive because we always think that all natural is better, but if you're using a natural bristle brush, whether it's goat hair or anything else, the bees are going to think that that's an animal that's attacking them, and they're going to send out an alarm pheromone, and they're going to get pretty riled up. So the synthetic bristles are actually better in this one instance. You have the uncapping fork, barbecue lighter, mouse guard, entrance reducer, and a bucket or two. Some duct tape is never out of place. Some people like a frame grip, which is essentially like a spring-loaded thing that you can use to grab the top of the frame and lift it out of the box. Some people like a frame holder, which is a device that sits on the side of the hive with two dogs facing out. You can just rest the frame, a frame that you pull out of the box on that, and keep it safe until you're ready to put it back in the box. But the number one protective gear rule is that you want to feel safe. You want to feel as though you've met your level of requirement for safety's sake. And you want to get the best protective gear that you can afford to your required level of safety. And you want to make sure that you also do the same for your friends. This poor donkey was being as the main transport for operation where they had Africanized bees. So this guy had to get all dressed up with everybody else to keep him safe. So if you join your local bee club, usually they have some tools that you can borrow or check out. And often you will be able to get anything that you need in order to process your honey, which is your extractors, uncapping tools, uncapping tanks, bottling buckets, filters. If you want to do outreach or education, usually there's an observation hive that's available, tents, tabling equipment, posters, tablecloths, all of those kinds of things, props. So those things can be had by joining your bee club and then using them in community with everybody else. And so that brings us to buying bees and queens. So you have two choices. How will you acquire your bees? Will you get a package, a nucleus colony, or a swarm of feral bees? Will you make a split, or someone you know make a split and give you some? Will you purchase a full-blown mature hive? And then what kind of bees are going to be right for you? So are you going to purchase locally adaptive bees? Are you going to bring in bees from a different region? And then think about the variety of bees, because the different varieties have different traits and attributes. Or are you going to get something that's specialty bred? So swarms, probably the most, probably come from a successful colony, probably. Could also be an absconded, unsuccessful colony, and you don't know which. So it's better to install a swarm on drawn equipment. If you just take a swarm and you put it in a box that has nothing but foundation in it, there's not much incentive for the bees to stay. They will probably just swarm out again. So it's possibly an older queen. Generally speaking, when the bees do swarm, if you remember, from last week, it will be the old queen will take a large portion of the bees from the donor colony and fly out. And so it's going to usually be your older queen with a large portion of the colony's bees from their donor colony. However, it could be an after swarm, and in that case, it will be not the old queen, but a new virgin, and it could be a few new virgins in a single swarm, or several small after swarms that leave with various virgin queens. So they may carry disease, so that might be that absconded colony that was not successful, and they left their box and they have flown out to try to find another home because there's too many stressors, which could be a disease stressor. So, and they may not show up. You may not be able to find a swarm at a time when you would want to, and they may not stay if you get them in the box. So the DCB Club has a swarm squad. If you're brand new to beekeeping, usually they ask you to shadow someone a few times first before you attempt your own swarm rescue. And not just the DC beekeepers, but also several of the other regional clubs have swarm squads of some sort. So packages are not local bees, with very, very few rare exceptions. Local bees are almost always nukes, almost always recommended. We're going to talk more about this in future lectures, but packages, about 3 pounds of assorted bees in a screen box. There's no drawn comb. The queen in there is not necessarily the mother of all the bees that are in there. It's not necessarily an established colony. She might be a brand new queen. She may even be a virgin. And the producer for the package, especially if they know that they're sending out virgin queens, may drop a whole bunch of extra drones in that box. So you're not even getting all worker bees. You're getting a bunch of drones. And if you have a whole bunch of drones from somewhere else, that's going to impact the viability of your local bee breeders' stock. So you're going to be interrupting their ability to provide you with locally adaptive queens in the future. And they may arrive earlier because they usually come from somewhere warm where they have bees actively producing year-round. And they may be cheaper, but you may pay for them in the long run. They are more work to start, they're riskier, and you may not get a first-year harvest. You may not have a mated queen. If you, and they may do the same thing that swarm that you catch does. These are, in fact, often referred to as shook swarms. If you put it in a box and there's no brood in the box and there's no drawn comb, they may just leave. So a colony started from a package needs to be fed until it doesn't need to be fed anymore. It will be hungry all summer. you can't overfeed packages. So you get them, you install them, and you feed them and feed them and feed them and feed them, and requeen them with a local queen, and then you feed them and feed them and feed them and hope they make it through the winter, and then that following year they may produce for you. So if you buy a package, plan to requeen it. And yeah, not even the package supplier knows if the queen is viable. She may not be mated. Your package supplier may know that she hasn't been mated and give you an unmated queen, even though they should be ready to go. And then usually they have never seen that queen perform. So even if she has gone through her mating cycle, if they've never watched her perform, they don't know how well she performs. She may not be a good queen. She may not lay a good brood pattern. So you don't know. And then the packages that you get from some of these hotter regions may be hot, as in aggressive, and they may be second cross, the F2 generation. So not if not the queen, not the queen's daughter, but the queen's granddaughter, because of the way these genes fit together with Russian bees intermating with other European stock and with Africanized bees intermating with European stock. That granddaughter's generation, that hive, may be excessively aggressive. So they may not be the best bees to have in town. Package queens are frequently superseded anyway. It's just better to control the process. And then most years, 1 out of 3 packages are just not viable. So you can order your package and order a local queen, put them on some drawn comb, even with some brood in there, if you can get a hold of some brood from somebody, and that's your best shot. And then just feed, feed, feed. So a nucleus is not necessarily a local queen. However, your local bee producers will make nukes. And a nucleus colony is what it sounds like. It's a nuclear family of the larger colony. So it's 5 frames. So you will still need to put 3 more frames if you're running 8s, or 5 more frames if you're running 10s. A nucleus colony, or a nuke of bees, is 2 to 3 frames of bees with brood in all ages and stages. So eggs, little larvae, pupa, adult bees, everything. And so 1 frame of honey or nectar and some pollen. An established, accepted, and laying queen that's been assessed. A much stronger start, more likely to survive the winter, may even have a harvest in the first year. But they may cost more. They do cost more. They will arrive later, and you still have to feed them, but you feed them until they don't need to be fed anymore, and then they're ready to go. So one thing that is an option is a marked queen, and that's a little dot that is put on the queen's carapace. And most marked queens will follow a 5-year rotation of colors. This is somewhat standardized. If you look at it, it's basically the rainbow color order, except for red and yellow are flipped. So years that end in 1 and 6 are white, 2 and 7 are yellow, 3 and 8 are red, 4 and 9 are green, and 5 and 0 are blue. If a queen was marked and is no longer marked, you know that it's not your original queen. She has been superseded. And then there are mentors in town who can help you mark a queen, or you can, if you order your bees, you can request that the queen is marked. Most of the people who mark queens use a simple paint pen, And then if you try to do it yourself, just make sure that you get a very small dot. You don't drown the bee in pen paint, because she will be rejected, and then you're going to have a mess on your hand. So getting queens. Queens arrive in several kinds of cages, and so this is what they call a JZBZ queen cage. You can put a candy in here, that's like a fondant style candy, or you can put a cap over this end. There's a little plug that pops out here and opens this way, and then this whole top is hinged, and the whole hinged top can open out the other way. So there's a number of ways to fill these cages and also to use them for introduction. This is, and there's plenty of room in here to put a couple of other bees to attend to the queen. This is what they call a California queen cage. There's not really room for attendant bees. This is where you would put the candy up inside of here. This is your standard queen cage. This whole white section here is the fondant candy, and on the far side of that is a cork that you need to pop the cork off if you're going to use the candy to do a slow introduction. These are just some pictures of packages. Here's the queen cage that came with the package, and the can of syrup that has a couple of little holes just to feed the bees while they're in transport. One thing to note is when you are going to let the queens introduce themselves by eating through the sugar candy and working their way out while the other bees work their way in, you always want to make sure that the entrance is facing upwards, and that way if any of the attendant bees die in there, the queen is not stuck behind the attendant bee blocking the entrance. So the various variety of bees that you may want to have are going to depend on the kind of beekeeper you plan to be. Where do you live? What do you want to do with your bees? What kind of thing fits your style? Are you intense? Are you practical? Are you lazy? And then you can't force the flow. Late bees won't be early, and early bees won't be slow. So you have to winter them accordingly and respond and get out ahead of their swarm impulse accordingly. You want to make sure that you get the right bees for yourself. So there's a lot of different kinds of bees out there. We're only going to really talk about 3 of them, but here's some of them: Italians, Cornelians, Russians, Minnesota Hygienic, VHS, Survivors, Certified Buckfast, Cordovian, Carnica, Caucasian, Hawaiian, Russian Hybrid, Starline, Midnight, New World, All-American, and Australian. And some of the characteristics are hardy, hygienic, gentle, productive, and instrumentally inseminated. So the Italian bees are your most common honey production bee. They're yellow coloring, their most common variety. They're good honey producers and normally not as defensive as some of the other kinds of bees, so they're gentler. They don't have the strongest swarm impulse. They don't use a lot of propolis, so things aren't all glued together and sticky. But they do tend to be pretty aggressive when it comes to robbing out other colonies. And they use heavy stores to raise brood, and then they use heavy stores to raise brood, and then they use heavy stores to raise brood. These guys run through a whole heck of a lot of food, and they don't usually stop breed production when other strains of bees would. So they may not survive the winter because they are just going to run out of food. Your Carniolan bees are also very gentle. They're very good at wintering over. They're also less propolis in their colonies. They may come through the winter as a very small cluster, but they will build up very rapidly in spring. You have to get out ahead of their swarm impulse for sure. They usually don't do a lot of robbing. They tend to swarm more due to their rapid buildup, and then they're not usually as productive, which is to say they may only produce 4 gallons of a 5-gallon bucket, whereas the Italians will produce 5, but you may have to keep replacing the Italians, so maybe 4 gallons of honey might be enough. And then the colors are a little bit more varied, whereas the Italians tend to be sort of blonde honey color. Your Carniolan bees are going to have more variance in their coloring. So there's Russian bees, and the Russian bees are usually slightly smaller, usually much darker in color. They have a rapid buildup, low food consumption. They're not inclined to rob, and they are somewhat pest resistant due to just a very slight variation in their life cycle. They do rapid brood rearing adjustments depending on what's happening in the environment, and then they are believed to do better in a closed Russian population, and this is because that F2, the granddaughter generation, can be pretty aggressive. And then they can be also very difficult to requeen because they're pretty picky about accepting other bees into their colony. So the Minnesota hygienic originally developed to sense American foulbrood in brood and remove it. Later, an effort was included to include Varroa mite baby removal. The VHS, the bees were developed to detect fertile foundress Varroa mites and remove them. The New World Carniolians were initially developed as resistant to tracheal mites, and later emphasis was placed on the removal of phoretic mites. So those would be the Varroa mites that are on the bees themselves, pulling them off of each other. So the resistant equals proactive removal, tolerant equals passive removal. Its ability of the colony to carry a heavier level of mites than a normal colony. So this is Marla Spivak. She bred Minnesota hygienic. They were disease sensitive. They would remove sick brood. They had a proactive defense. And then there's the Varroa sensitive hygienic, the VSH. The Varroa mite sensitive could actually feel the foundress mites within the cells and remove them. They had a proactive defense. In the New World Carniolians, they were just more Varroa tolerant. They could survive higher mite loads, so that's a passive defense. So your local bees, imported bees, queens may be unmated or poor quality, may be disease vectors. So if you have one area where there's some kind of a disease and you import bees from there, you'll also be importing those bee diseases. Bees from warmer climates may be Africanized and may not be acclimated. Locally available bees support local suppliers, means that you have a sustainable local market, which means if you need a queen sometime in August, you call up your local provider, and because you supported them all along, they're able to have queens available for you when you need them. So local producers know the bees that they sell, and they're usually available on fairly short notice. And usually the lines of bees that they have are more viable because they're acclimated. They may need fewer interventions, so less actual management needs to get done. But just be forewarned that not all locally available bees are local. So there will be a lot of quote end quote local nuke producers that will split out their colonies and create nucleus colonies from their splits, and then they'll order queens from somewhere warmer, like Hawaii or Tennessee or Georgia, and then they'll drop those not local queens into those splits that they made their nukes out of, and then they will call them local nucleus colonies. So just be forewarned that not every local producer is actually producing local bees. And then here's a little quiz. What color, what year is white? 1 and 6. Yellow is 2 and 7. Red is 3 and 8. Green is 4 and 9. And blue is 5 and 0. And this is Abdul, and he would like you to go keep some bees with him. And that is that.